Good morning, ma'am. Ma'am, are you able to hear me?
Hi. Good morning. Yeah, am I audible too?
Yes, ma'am. You are complete.
Yeah.
Ma'am, can you give us a 5 minutes so that we'll just settle down and then we'll...
Absolutely, no problem. I will keep myself muted and I'll keep my video also off for the time being.
Okay, ma'am. Fine. Thank you, ma'am.
Once you're ready, I can start. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
A warm welcome to everyone present here. Your presence makes this moment even more special. In joy, gratitude, in sorrow, hope, let our prayers be whispers that connect hearts to something greater. Now, I request everyone to raise for the prayer song. सत्यपरम् त्रिसत्यम् सत्यस्य योनिर्निहितं च सत्ये सत्यस्य सत्यम् हृदसत्यनेत्रम् सत्यात्मकम् त्वां शरणं प्रपन्नाः वाणी गुणानुकतने श्रवणौ कथाया हस्तौ च कर्मसु मनस्तव पादयोनः स्मृत्यां शिरस्तव निवास जगत्प्रणामे दृष्टि सदा दर्शनेतु भवत्तनूना नमो भगवते तस्मै कृष्णाय बुद्धकृत्मते जगत्क्रीडति यो यतः ॐ शान्ति. On behalf of Postgraduate Department of English and Postgraduate Department of Psychology, STNB Vaishnav College for Women, I take the privilege in welcoming you all to the National Conference on Health Humanities, intersection of health, literature, arts, society, and culture. We feel privileged to have a distinguished guest, Dr. Bindu Lakshmi, Associate Professor, Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai campus, with us today. Now, I would like to invite Persian from First MA English to introduce our orator. A hearty welcome and a great morning to one and all present here. I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to welcome you all of the fifth day of national level conference, Health Humanities, intersection of health, literature, arts, culture, and society. It gives me an immense pleasure to welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Bindu Lakshmi. She is an associate professor and chairperson at the Advanced Center for Women's Studies in the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She has a PhD in sociology from IIT Bombay, and she has been actively engaged in teaching and in critical disability studies. Her research areas includes feminist disability studies, gender, labor and migration, mental health, mental anthropology and ethnography. Her research explores questions of aging, mental health and care arrangements. She has published journal articles and reviewed books and extensively written about domestic work, transnational labor, and gender migration. She has recently completed a collaborative research project that explored the lived experiences and perspectives of caregivers of children with neurodiversity with a specific focus on the autism spectrum. Indeed, she is an expert on the topic gender, body, and feminist disability studies. And we are extremely honored and proud to welcome Dr. Bindu Lakshmi. Welcome, ma'am. Thank you, Persia. Without prolonging the introduction, I would like to pass the session to Dr. Bindu Lakshmi, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Can everybody hear me properly?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and good morning, everybody. And no, I can see in this early morning a lot of audience in that auditorium. I wish I could be there physically with all of you because I know how difficult it is, this online communication often. You always feel a disconnect. In case there is any problem, if you're not able to hear me properly, if you are finding difficulty, that is often happens in online communication, please no, either raise your hand or you can no, speak up. You can tell me. Yeah. So yeah, without much delay, I'll just begin to the session. But before that, I also wanted to thank no, particularly SNDB Vaishnav College taking this initiative. This very interesting set of people you are bringing in, and also this many days of conference on looking at intersections of health and humanities. It is very much, much indeed. And I'm really congratulating the Department of English and Department of Psychology for taking this initiative. And also a special thank to Dr. Karthika for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Um, I will begin with a few conceptual conversations on talking about gender, body, and feminist disability studies. I had a conversation early this morning with Dr. Karthika just to get a sense of whom am I talking to, because when you are doing an online lecture, often it is difficult to figure out where are students and other audiences coming from. So I was told primarily there are many postgraduate students from literature and psychology. So I'm going to pitch in my lecture primarily hoping that you are familiar with certain discourses, certain theoretical articulations. If not, please feel free to ask me. No, we can get into a communication after the presentation is over. So while making this interconnection between gender, body, and feminist disability theories, I'm not necessarily going into a detailed discussion on gender theories. I assume some of you or most of you are familiar with as postgraduate students in literature and psychology. However, I'll directly enter into the disability studies discourse. That seems to be a newer domain, a newer scholarship that has been emerging over last 2-3 decades now. So when we are trying to talk about framing disability, disability as disability studies as an academic paradigm, let us also remember there are different vantage point from which we can look at disability as a concept, as an analytical category. one of the very dominant and one of the strong articulation that comes from, obviously, from the medical model, which you probably know of, the medical model of disability. In the medical model, it is always locating disability in individual bodies, talking about individual body as a problem, as something wrong with an individual body with a disability, which requires to be treated, which requires to be cured, and which needs medical intervention. So this seems to be one of the very dominant model that is available to us. It is that medical model that comes in for various reasons. So at one level, we know that medical science is a medical dominant knowledge paradigm that brings medical model as one of those important entity when we are talking about disability. However, outside medical model, and we know that medical model, there are a lot of questions that has been raised from social scientists and people who are critically looking at medical model, trying to look at, is it only about individual problem? Is it only about individually locating our disabilities on our body? Or is there other social concerns we need to talk about? I will come to that in a while as I speak. So while locating the problem on our individual bodies, talking about is an individual with a disability, there is it is the assumption that there is something wrong with that body, which requires to be treated and medical intervention needs to be needed. There are certain other models that's also available to us. Another one is the charity model, which probably you are again perhaps familiar with, where we assume that there is a problem. No, disability as an issue, as a problem, but it can be addressed with certain ways in which you would give generous. It is a problem. It's a charity needs to be done. We need to probably give something like it can be raised through generous giving. You can give in terms of donation. In case of there are different ways in which a charity model operates. While when we see charity model, there is another thing, another model of disability discourse that is also emerging over last a decade or so. That is which I would call something called a super crip model. Super crip in the sense that when we are saying super crip, it assumes that a model of disability as a challenge, but that some people can overcome it. Disabled people can overcome it, they overcome that disability. They becomes the superheroes or superheroines, if you wish to call. And for example, you must have heard of this Blade Runner, who can run faster, or somebody with a disability climbing up to Mount Everest. It has been talked about and showed as superheroes doing this. Or even certain daily acts which has been with a disability, they are doing it, it is considered as and romanticized about that. So this is another version of articulation of disability which we see on every day. So when I'm saying medical model on one side, charity model, and the super crip model, it has been often comes and we must be reading all this very what we call it as the inspiration model in newspapers, media outlets saying that somebody challenging disability and doing wonderful things to do. Sometimes it is as a normative thing what we do, they would be also doing, persons with disability also doing it, but it has been portrayed as something, a superhero. So in the context of all of this, what is not getting addressed, and that is the concern. What is not getting addressed is the question of discrimination and what needs to be done. Is it only about a medical intervention that is needed, or is it only about we are generously giving what is it donations and trying to see it as charity, or then there are these inspirations available, we get inspired and romanticizing this idea of somebody is challenging disability. What else can be done? What needs to be done? And this is where this idea of addressing questions of social discrimination that needs to be addressed, that needs to be understood. So this has been something which has been there for a long time. How do we then even talk about disability? Not necessarily as an individual problem. That is something which needs to be looked at as a societal issue, where the society's disabling conditions, there are discriminatory environment that needs to be addressed and that needs to be looked at. This is where we would say the emergence of social model of disability that emerged, that in fact emerged in the 70s, in the early 80s, particularly through a large group of British social scientists who are also social scientists who has this very strong socialist agenda, who has been looking at and trying to understand how there are systemic oppression faced by disabled people who are not able to enter into the labor market because there are no job opportunities available because the system is so ableist, labor market is so ableist, there are not adequate opportunities that people get. So one need to enter into the labor market. So this has been addressed, this question of systemic oppression that has been addressed by this group of British social scientists. That is where this idea, the genesis of looking at disability as not a problem, but we need to address the systemic oppression, the discrimination that is faced by people that need to be looked at. So I just wanted to share my screen to show you something. I hope I have the adequate, just give me a second. Can you see what I'm sharing in the screen? Can someone?
Yes, ma'am.
What do you see in the screen now? If someone can tell me, what do you see? You know what it is? Just describe the image, what is there in the screen.
It is a bridge which is used to cross from one side to
Yeah,
another.
it is not a bridge. It is actually a cattle grid. You must have seen this cattle grid, which is kept on roads and which is in fact, for example, uh, by, restricting cattle and other animals entering into institutions and places. So they make this cattle grid. Have you seen this anywhere? Have you seen this kind of cattle grids anywhere? Any institutions, any places, any government offices?
Yes, I have seen.
You have seen this. And where did you see this?
I have seen this in a government place. It's in a court.
In some court, in government offices, we see this kind of barriers, right? Which is stopping cattle to enter in. Okay, so I'm stopping this image. Everybody has seen this. No, this is a cattle grid. It is no, that is, if you look at it, these are iron bar on the road, which is no, some of them is a cylindrical one, and there are it obstruct cattle to enter in. So they wanted to secure the area so that government functionaries and all can work properly. Okay. So let me come back after stop sharing. Okay. So you have seen it and you must have seen that it has a purpose. But come to think of it, this is what I wanted to take your attention to when we are talking about what we see as ableism around us. Do you think this structure is also ableist? Is it ableist? You know what is ableism, right? Do you know what is ableism?
Yes, ma'am. We are able to see that it is meant to care away the cattle, but I'm also wondering about maybe a visually impaired learner if he's going to pass by that way. I really don't know which will he be able to.
Yes. Oh, for example, somebody is using a white a stick in order to navigate her or his way, or someone using a whatever we call a crutches, for example, will find it difficult to navigate, right? Something like that. So, so that is something, a structure which is built in, assuming that only we are restricting animals entry. We are restricting entry to the cattle and others. But when we try to think about, we humans also find it difficult to navigate some of those places. So, but then what happens is that when we call it as a problem, when we call it as a systemic operation, this is how ableism operate in our everyday life. Some of the counter argument immediately will come. ये क्या problem है आपको दिक्कत है? If you have no, so I'll speak in English. I'm sorry. I recognizing that I'm speaking to a group of people located in South India. So when we talk about what is the problem? Why do you what is the what do you why do you want to make it as a big issue? We are there to help you out. We can lift you. We can take you inside. But that is the problem, because when the moment we raise it as an issue, the moment we say this is a problem which we are not able to cross because there is a barrier, someone else is very patronizing and telling us, no, don't worry, we will be able to help you out. This patronizing attitude, this kind of charity attitude is a problem, because then we don't recognize what we call as an internalized oppression, internalized and structural discrimination that operates in the everyday life. So this has been, this is one instance, but we will see number of things around us. If you try to look at probably the table and chair which we write, everything, there will be see that ableism has been often there. The ideology of ableism largely around us. So this is something which we need to look at. So the social model of disability, in fact, calling out this issue and saying that there is a problem, there is a systemic oppression. Let us address that. Let us address it in through talking about making our structures much more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Everybody should be included within that. The moment you are trying to make certain structure and saying that only someone can enter in and others we will help, that patronizing attitude is not necessarily an inclusive approach. It is not an inclusive approach. So let us need to address that. So this ways the social model of disability, in fact, brought the context of discrimination, questions of marginalization much more clearly. And also it attempted to look at medical model much more critically. Coming back to medical model again, medical model attempts to see that our bodies are impaired bodies. There is an impairment. It's much more individualized, and there is a medical problem which needs to be. So what disability, social model of disability is asking us to do, let us move out of impairment model and let us look at the disabling environment around us, the ableist environment around us, the structures which is systematically oppressing us, and then try to come back to look at and focusing on that. So disability came as a terminology as well, came much more strongly. And another word you probably familiar with, this is much in use these days. It has initially came as an initiative of the government of India from one of the talks from our Prime Minister in the Man Ki Baat, where he talked about this idea of talking about persons with disability as Divyangjan. Have you heard this word Divyangjan? Anyone? I'm sorry, I'm asking the group to interact because is it? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I am aware that it is a legal term which is used. I think
That
children or something. I'm really not very clear with the Hindi.
Yes, Divyangjan, if you translate it, is the divine body. The disabled persons with disabilities immediately considers the divine body. So when the government, when the our representatives of the government talked about our bodies as divine, what they are missing out, what requires to be done. So disability rights activists always talked about, don't call us divine. Don't call us divine bodies. It is not, there is no divinity in our body. These are like ordinary bodies like you and me. No, we are all, no, our bodies are normal. It will, it will go through stress. It will go through problems. It will go through joys and, various things. There is nothing divinity about having a disabled body. But that insistence on calling Divyangjan will also then taking the problem away, taking the attention from what needs to be done in terms of addressing the systemic oppression. So there is a disability rights activist, in fact, made this very clear in their various articulations and discourse. They're saying that we reject this idea of calling us Divyangjan. Rather, we would like to call ourselves as persons with disability and addressing the oppression and discrimination that we face in everyday life. So this is something which we need to look at. But then coming to the context of feminist disability studies, one might wonder what is feminism to do with disability studies often. From a very basic level, I would talk about what feminism has to do with the disability studies, because at one level, disability studies, particularly social model of disability study, is attempting to look at discrimination and oppression. The way feminist discourse, feminist movement is done, attempting to look at questions of sexism, questions of misogyny, questions on systemic oppression based by gender marginal communities. And so there are one immediate connection we can make between feminism and disability studies. More than that, when we are talking about feminist disability studies, it is also attempting to take the vision, take the perspective of disability much more broader, and also that vision of feminism it gets articulated much more clearly, because as we know, as feminist scholars, often we don't talk about only gender. We don't talk gender as an isolated category. We always talk about feminism. We always talk about gender as in an intersectional perspective. We say that gender doesn't operate in isolation. It constantly communicate with where do we come from, which caste, community, our ability status, religion, region, number of things get intersected as we speak on gender. So gender is never an isolated, independent entity. It is not a historical entity. It's a historical category. So once we understand gender in not an isolated category, that is where feminist disability studies make sense, because we are using disability as an analytical category in order to make connection between gender and disability. So this is something, an immediate entry point to talk about. Feminist scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson and has written a number of fascinating work on extending the idea of feminist uh, disability studies scholarship, where talked about how this idea of disability moved from earlier it is in the realm of medical science, social work, questions of rehabilitation, but it has come to talk about identity in that sense. That is where we would talk about talking about disability, our own location within ability disability system. How do we talk about feminist disability studies? So there is a very strong connection with feminist disability studies and institutional history of women's studies, because women's studies over a period of time systematically looked at questions on discrimination in different ways. Looking at from global discourse as well as in Indian discourse, we know how women's studies and feminist gender studies looked at questions on race, ethnicity, sexuality, class. So when we are talking about a disability, we cannot, we have to talk about in an intersectional perspective. What happens here is that as we try to understand what feminist disability studies all about, we also know that there is no specific model available to us to talk about how do we define feminist disability studies. Do we have a template? Do we have there is an archival material to think about, because there are there adequate documentation to look at? Let us remember, when we are talking about disability as an analytical category, as a category of analysis to understand how we produce knowledge in university spaces, in various representations we see. For example, the one we saw in that the cattle grid. The moment we use critical lens to look at from disability studies, we know that what's the problem with that cattle grid. It is not just a cattle grid to eliminate or barring cattle. It is also to do with, it is eliminating number of humans. It is also trying to tell us what an ideal human is. what is a normal human is. And that is something which fundamentally we are trying to question. We are trying to question what is this idea of a normal, what is this idea of normal itself, and what is this idea of an ideal ideal normal human itself. Because when you're trying to put a cattle barrier in a government office, you are essentially saying that a set of people who need to enter and access government service from that office should not be, will not get it. So you are in fact excluding number of humans from that. So we are using disability as a category of analysis, as an analytical category to understand what is happening around us. So this is also in some sense when we are talking about uh, and again coming back to trying to think about questions of feminist disability studies, let us also try to think about the way we are trying to connect gender and disability through our understanding on critique on our body. We are also extending the conversation and challenging the available mainstream feminist discourse. We are saying that, see, there is a different perspective that comes in. Let me give you an example. You must have heard of, for example, this, one of the very strong and dominant conversation that happens in feminist discourses, right to right to decide what we want to do with our own body, right? The right to our own body and body autonomy. And which feminists, as feminists, we talk about our body autonomy. How do we talk about our body? You must be familiar with this usual discussions around abortion debate, right to abortion. Right to abortion as a fundamental right for every woman doesn't need to wait for the male counterpart to talk about, or somebody else doesn't need to go through these moral conversations. It's a woman's fundamental right to decide her own body, because she goes through this process. But then there is also a tension that comes from disability rights scholars. For example, there is also, what do we do when a fetus is anomalous fetus? Then there is this compulsion to remove that anomalous fetus through medical termination of pregnancy. There are disability rights activists raised questions about how do we take conversations on our rights, right as a woman to decide what we want to do with our body. But at the same time, we are also thinking that a world should be always with a set of able-bodied human beings. We are not then trying to think about a world which can also occupy by our diversity in body, our diversity in different articulations we comes from. So there are a lot of tensions in number of these contexts as we speak. So, however, what feminist disability studies is also trying to tell us is that it is helping us. Uh, how do we understand human diversity? That the way we try to understand our body, the materiality of the body, that needs to be challenged through number of ways in which it interacts with the world around us. How do we even try to interpret bodily differences that comes from? So. Having said that, let me also take you to a little bit further discussions. I have another slide to bring here. So let me see whether I can share the screen again. Give me a second. Mhm. Can you see the slides?
Yes,
Can,
ma'am.
okay. What do you see? Because I want to know whether you're seeing the same what I see in my screen. What do you see in the screen? Can you read the first line?
From feminist disability studies, understands disability.
Understands disability as a system of exclusions, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah. So if I try to give a definition to what is feminist disability studies, let us also try to understand it is trying to help us to look at what gets excluded, a system of exclusions that often stigmatizes human differences. So when we are trying to look at through feminist disability lens, it help us to unpack. We are as human beings, we comes with our own differences, both bodily, both materially and socially. We are in different locations, but at the same time, what are the count through which there are systems of exclusions that operates that take certain humans outside the conversation. It also helps us to uncover identities. What kind of the certain bodies, there are stigmatized body has been produced, certain ways in which we talk about what is an ideal body, what is not an ideal body. So that kind of conversation, what kind of community, what kind of identity bodies, the questions on disability produce. It also helps us, it reveals discriminatory attitudes and practices that directed towards those bodies. For example, there are stereotypes that gets generated often, trying to talk about, no, this is something, she may not be able to talk like this because she's a person with a mental illness. Certain kind of attitude which stereotypes we bring in when we see someone with a someone with a disability. So there are discriminatory attitudes, there are practices that get directed towards these bodies. More importantly, it is also helping us to explore the social category, disability as a social category of analysis. So everything we look at, we attempt to look at through the lens of what needs to be done. Why is that certain idea of normativity, certain idea of normal gets created? Who is getting excluded from the conversation? What can be done? What needs to be done? How do we even talk about that? And then it fundamentally, when we are talking about feminist disability studies, it is also talking to us about the power relations that operates in society. Because when we are trying to place the question of power, we know that there are certain ways in which certain bodies get stigmatized, stereotyped, and often considered as abject bodies. So this is something which we need to look at. I probably don't want to get into some of the theoretical conversations right now. If it is a face-to-face talk, which would have been better, we could have done some of this thing in elaboration. But I wanted to take your attention to some of this discussion as students of postgraduate students. You may be interested looking at, for example, feminist philosopher Judith Butler's idea of body, where she's trying to look at both the materiality and construction, and where body is inhabiting a space in between, taking the feminist philosopher Judith Butler's idea of body a little further to think about how do we look at the inhabiting spaces in between. How do we think about bodies and its normative limits in different ways? Why is it feminist disability perspectives important for us? It's important for multiple reasons. One, pedagogically, as students and scholars in higher education places, we know that we need to address some of these questions much more clearly as as a pedagogic exercise. How do we even talk about disability as an important analytical category? It is challenging the way we look at knowledge production. Who is producing that quote unquote legitimate knowledge? Sometimes we think that knowledge can produce only through certain ideas. The moment disability is an analytical category, it is challenging some of those normative limits. It is also helping us then think about pedagogically what are the other possibilities to think about disability as an analytical category, thinking about knowledge creation, who can be the legitimate knowledge producer, and what location it comes in. Of course, it is also theoretically mediated. It talks about, it gives us a set of theoretical lens to look at the society in a different way, different perspectives. Now, for example, I was wondering, I don't know how your auditorium perhaps looks like. Maybe for a moment, if you try to think about the place where you are sitting currently, you can imagine, is it inclusive? If it is not, what needs to be done? Do you think, is it wheelchair accessible? Is it, how are the tables and chairs located? Who get to see, get to hear, what gets produced? So how do we change our, the analytical framing when disabilities as an analytical category, and particularly intersections of gender and disability, we would see that we are trying to make world perhaps a better and much more inclusive. ways. And then it also institutionally help us to talk about what needs to be done in terms of our own rights and entitlement, not necessarily talking about our body as divine bodies, rather within institutional discourse, how do we talk about institutions are accountable when we are talking about disability as an analytical category. Rosemary Garland Thompson brings in number of ways in which we can imagine critical practices in feminist disability studies. One, it tends to avoid impairment specific or medical diagnostics category to think about disability. So moving outside the impairment model, moving outside the medical diagnostic categories to come to think about disability as a category to analyze. Having said that, no, I wanted to take your attention here, for example, in a medical school, the interface in a clinic. Sometimes interface in a clinic, we would give it to the medical practitioners to decide. But at the same time, the moment you try to bring in disability as an analytical category, you would see that what are the ways in which we can reimagine the idea of body in medical practices. Questions of our, as no, it is also questioning our assumptions by using precise language when talking about disability. And this is something we may need to pay attention to. Language, and again, as postgraduate students of literature, I don't need to tell you about this. How do we be mindful about the precise language when we are talking about disability? Over a period of time, the language of disability has significantly changed. For example, talking about, you must have heard that the questions on impairment to disability is one shift. But at the same time, we also don't want to use the word differently abled. Because differently abled doesn't necessarily, because it again, bringing ableism as the standard, as the point. So the moment we are talking about persons with disability and taken disability as the language to articulate, it also brings in the questions on oppression, questions on what rights need to be talked about. And then, no, the feminist theories have been challenged by disability, trying to bring in questions of identity, intersectionality as an entry point has been widened through these conversations on disability, and also investigating embodiment. Because again, talking about embodiment in feminist scholarship, we know that the discussions on embodiment in feminist disability studies, we said that let us pay attention to both the materiality of the body as well as the discursive articulations of body as it comes in. Other ways in which we need to reimagine feminist disability studies through the notion of care. It is also helping us to reimagine care and care ethics. I'm not quite sure how far you know some of these conversations in feminist ethics of care, feminist ethics of care as articulated by Carol Gilligan, philosopher Carol Gilligan. At one level, it is as ethics of care as interdependent, but at the same time, when we are talking about care in the disability study discourse, often we thought that care is a linear process. There is a carer and there is somebody to be cared for. However, feminist ethics of care challenged that linear articulations, or that one-sided articulations of care, talking about care is much more mutually, a mutually done, a relational practice, and it is much more interdependent care relation. So bringing feminism and disability scholarship together, helping us to then think about the conventional notion of there is a disabled individual who needs to be cared for, and there is an able-bodied individual who will be the carer. That assumption gets shattered the moment we try to connect both feminism and disability, because it is then challenging some of those conventional wisdom about what disability is all about. How do we talk about idea of care? Who cares for whom? And for example, some of the work which we have been doing during COVID pandemic, we were looking at care practices within the context of autism spectrum. It in fact throw up a number of ways in which care relations are articulated in the home, because it's a research which I have done. We looked at during COVID pandemic, when everything got locked down, people were living together in the families where persons with disability, some of them been otherwise going to vocational homes, etc., has been stayed at home. And then how care arrangement has radically shifted. It is no longer the old articulations of there is a able-bodied carer who is caring for you. There's been many families found that there are radical shift in the way of care has been imagined. When your ableist parent, not ableist, able-bodied parent who becomes who is caught up with diagnosed with COVID, then there is a disabled adult child taking care of your able-bodied parents. So it is a shifting number of conversations in disability, number of conversations in the way in which we think about care. And in fact, feminist disability studies reframed and reimagined care in radical ways than we imagine. It is no longer the old care practice of we think about, carer is always imagined as the able-bodied, ideal, normative, person. It is, we will see our own vulnerability and how do we even see that framework work in different ways. Feminist disability studies also help us to challenge the way we think about the appearance. And this probably I don't need to elaborate. Some of you are probably familiar with some of these discussions. When we are talking about politics of appearance, there are a lot of discussions on how bodies have been often stereotyped and stigmatized through certain assumptions. You are familiar with this fat shaming, for example. Somebody saying that you are too fat, you have to do something. The fat shaming and all, everyday sexism, everyday body shaming, many of us go through in our daily lives. And feminist disability studies, in that sense, are helping us to critically look at what is the problem with these articulations. How do we need to, talk about the politics of, appearance? And for example, some of this, emerging field in fat studies. Fat studies, fat studies is emerging a field in feminist disability theories. We would see that there are scholars who are questioning this conventional wisdoms of what an ideal body should be, and lot of not only fat shaming, the way in which what is a certain idea of whiteness which comes in a fairer body, and all of this, big capital, it is investing in Indian market. We know that Indian market is also dominated by this idea of colorism. For example, there is this desire for fairer skins which comes in, and it is helping us to question some of these stereotypes and assumptions that comes in imposed, and trying to create certain idea of normativity. So these are the places. Politics of appearance is one context in which feminist disability studies have invested quite a bit. And another place of investigation would be to look at this notion of notion of representation. Again, students of literature, you know that when we are talking about representations, how do you see disabled bodies are represented? Either through literature, through historical ways. Literature, there are abundant examples to give, mythologically, and in other contexts, there is this idea of a monstrous body, or that comes in through often various representation that comes in. And often subjugated bodies are portrayed in a particular way. It is either as inadequate or considered as working in certain conditions. And also, when we talk about the representation, we know that the film representations, where do we see disabled bodies are featured in our mainstream cinema, for example. We would look at a disabled body will be often either as victimized or a villainized, or even somebody who requires service, charity from somebody. You won't see a disabled person, and particularly a gendered disabled individual. In that sense, a woman with a disability often portrayed in a particular way, often in various other representations. I was thinking about this movie Barfi, for example, where a person with cognitive disabilities always been infantilized, juvenile, even though the person is an adult. So this kind of representations we would see often, and that kind of racial profiling that comes in, and how do we, and normalizing often violence and sometimes it enter into certain ways to talk about certain ways of eugenics and removing the disabled individual and try to think about an ideal world. So representation comes very strongly in some of our conversations. I probably have one more, or maybe not. I can go ahead without. I was thinking I have one more slide to show. Um, okay, so give me a second. Yeah. Then when we're talking about this questionable representation, again, the connection which we can make with gender, body, and feminist disability studies, coming closely to look at our body, how certain body practices has been normalized over a period of time. For example, there is this investment from big pharma, big capital often comes in giving investment in aesthetic surgery, cosmetic surgery, for example, a market-driven logic behind developing certain ways of an ideal body that comes in. This is where we see the question of identity, body, feminist politics and activism that would come in, and questioning certain ways in which bodies have been portrayed as we speak. So the politics of prosthetics, there is a whole lot of discussion in feminist disability studies. Again, I'm not entering into the debate. It's all probably lack of time. I would very briefly think about certain ways in which prosthesis, prosthetic bodies that came in. For example, there is, you may want to look at Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde is the black feminist scholar and the lesbian mother who talked about how do we her own relationship with breast cancer and who refused to do prosthesis and did not go through this process of after her breast surgery. So where is this famous discussion which she did? Every woman has the right to make her own choices of her body, because there is this compulsion to go through prosthetics to make it an ideal feminine body. There are also different ways in which we resist. We say that we don't want to go through the challenges. We don't want to go through those stereotypes when we say. So it comes back and it is some reaffirming some of the feminist politics which we bring on board when we are talking about bringing disability as an analytical category, which is helping us to then challenge the way we look at body. So to end with some set of discussion further, with the possible discussion, maybe we can bring it in after the talk is formally over. There is this thing about feminist disability studies and queer studies. There are a lot of literature that comes in. How do we, for example, as we say, there is a compulsory heteronormativity, right? There is a everything we look at through the binary, heteronormative, ideal marriages, and then the queer studies and queerness has challenged the idea of heteronormativity. In the similar vein, there is also, when we're talking about the compulsory, heterosexuality, a compulsory heteronormativity, there is also a compulsory able-bodiedness that comes to our lives, because everything has to be ideal and able. And then we don't give any provision for any differences. But when we are trying to look at through feminist disability studies, it is helping us to unpack like compulsory, the way we challenge compulsory heterosexuality, it is also necessary to challenge some of those ways ableism comes to consolidate our lives, regulate our life in different ways, and body shaming us and stereotyping us in different forms. Selective abortion I already discussed. I'm not entering into that. Another conversation that is a lot of scholarship coming these days is in the area of MAT studies. I brought in board here today because this is something I've been trying to work on for last several years. Again, trying to bring in questions on critical mental health, trying to think about whether possibilities to think about talking about MAT studies. In fact, emerged it is emerged from the West. It is from the global North, not necessarily from India. It emerged as a critique of dominant model of psychiatry. It is started questioning from a perspective of survivors of psychiatry, but then are there possibilities to think about extending and thinking about questions on mental health, certain ways we try to understand cognitive abilities, and coming back to then markers of physical disability, what we talk about, what are the connections we can make between the mind, that conventional Cartesian model of mind-body divide needs to be, blurred, and it gets blurred in different conversations. And how do we make that possible here? And to an extent, the idea of an object, what becomes an object body, who is an object, and outside the discourse, when we say an object body, who becomes outside the discourse, and that is bringing on board to talk about. I will end with this one slide here. Let me see whether can you see this image? Can someone see whether, can you see this image?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, ma'am, we can see.
Okay, you're seeing a person here, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you know who is this? This is the last slide, so don't worry, I'm not extending further. You know who is this? Any guess? Okay, this is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is an abolitionist famous, abolitionist feminist, sorry, abolitionist feminist, and a black feminist, and in fact one of those early theorists one can think about in terms of trying to bring questions on gender, race, and rights. Somebody who questioned both sexism and racism in the context of the slavery. She was born as a slave, Isabella. Then she has taken this name, Sojourner Truth, and started doing this walking tour. It is during the time of the period of slavery, and there is and the abolitionist movement has been very strong. So she had this famous talk called "Ain't I a Woman," which has been later written, adapted by many. But Sojourner Truth has been always been shown as a somebody who can challenge, very actively engaged, and taking masculinity into task, talking to white women and saying that let us also address the questions of black women coming from black women, and other women who are caught up between sexism and racism. But in fact, Sojourner Truth is also somebody who who has a disability in her right hand. But in any of the representation, any of the picture which is available to us, we won't see, because we have been always been taught and told about Sojourner Truth, who has been actively taking up with her able-bodied. So what I wanted to bring on board here, when we are talking about disability, sometimes certain things gets erased. That what happens even in popular movement, when we are saying we wanted to say that we are strong enough, we can challenge everything, then we think that we should not show our disability. We consider that as a vulnerability. But is it necessary? Is there another ethics of care that is possible, where we can also show our vulnerable self, and challenge the world, and challenge dominant assumptions through which stereotypes gets emerged primarily? And where I want to end it, when we are talking about feminist disability studies, and in a location where we are located, when I'm talking about, we are located in a location in India, in global south, where we are also marked with hierarchies of caste, discrimination on the basis of caste, discrimination on the basis of sexuality, where you belong, which language you speak, and all of that. There is a possibility for us to talk about these intersections, and feminist disability studies helping us and opening up that conversation to challenge the mainstream stereotypes that emerge through certain consolidated power structure. And that is something, that is a resistance which we keep doing, and we need to do, continuously need to do. And I will end here, and I hope something would come out of this conversation with all of you. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And yeah, that's it. Questions? Anybody?
Thank you, ma'am, for throwing light on disability studies and linking feminism and disability studies. I have something to add on to this presentation. Recently, I read a book, Finding the Element, written by Ken Robinson, in which he had illustrated the story of Robert Wilson. This Robert Wilson, he lost his vision when he was around 13 years old, when he was doing an experiment in the lab, and the lab attendant had, by mistake, he had used a sort of chemical instead of water, and while heating that test tube, he met with an accident. It burst out, and in that accident, almost many of the students affected, but this Robert Wilson, he lost his eyes. But that was the moment he found his element. So he was relating how one can find their element. Element in the sense it is finding one's best ability, passion. So then later he traveled. At that moment he decided, having recovered from the staying in the hospital for around 6 months, and then he decided this is not the end of his life. And he put up more efforts in such a way that he excelled in swimming, music, and in all the spheres he excelled. And he worked for the disabled people in such a way. He made extensive travel, and even in African countries he traveled. And there is a type of preventable disability. He came to know that there is, like, not apart from that by birth defect and by this such an accident, people lose their vision. And he came across that there is a category called random blindness. So in African on region of Africa, there are like some due to some insect bite, people are 10% of the people, they are losing their vision. Then he worked extensively with medical practitioners, and they found a sort of medicine so that they were able to prevent that type of disability. So he had addressed that preventable disability. So that way, it was quite intriguing for me to read that story of Robert Wilson. Just I wanted to share this in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Janani. I'm a research scholar from DIT Chennai. A couple of days ago, I came across this news article where this girl from England, who is 16 years old, an autistic individual, she committed suicide, and her diaries were taken by a famous professor at Cambridge University and a group of others from Cambridge who are researching into the reasons why she committed suicide, because apparently she received a detention, and then her father stated that was basically the reason for her suicide. But then I think there is more to it. But I think there are also a lot of people with mental illnesses and autistic individuals who are also suicidal, but then nobody seriously asks them about their experiences of suicidality when they are alive. But then I think, moreover, taking the 16-year-old's diary for research when she cannot give any kind of active consent is something of a violation. Even if her family has consented to it, I think it's a kind of a violation. So my question is two-part. So why don't they basically ask somebody who is autistic and is going through challenges of navigating through the society, and ask them about their lived experiences instead of violating somebody's privacy and taking their diary to do a research? And then the other thing is, what do you basically think about taking somebody's diary after their death and then using it as a source of research study.
So, your name Janani, no? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Janani, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Janani, for asking that question. And I just wanted to, though that was not part of the the brief today, but still, since you talked about the ethics of research ethics, I thought I would very briefly talk about because when we're talking about consent, research consent is something primary. No, we cannot violate the consent of when we are interviewing our interlocutor or taking it. So even taking a person who is no more and that person's diary, is it ethical? One would say no, because if the person is given at any point in time before the person no died, that this can be used for public consumption or research or writing. If it is not, that is one violation. It is also to an extent to talk about often it is not only dead or alive, it is also to do with how do we even place persons with cognitive disability on board. Sometimes we think that someone who cannot because we are so much cognitively ableist in our world around us. We think about there is certain ways in which we understand the world. So then people within the spectrum, often whether we infantilize, we try to think about juvenile, and there are interesting work that is happening. Maybe you're interested to look at. There are self-advocates in autism spectrum. They started challenging this conventional, articulation, saying that no, our voices need to be heard, and particularly when it comes to cognitive disability, there are a lot of self-advocates these days very actively talk about. But these are, of course, adult self-advocates who are within the spectrum, but who are able to talk, and also when you're talking about something like autism, it is also in a spectrum, right? Not everybody can be verbally articulate. There are non-verbal. There are different ways it comes in. However, certain ways in which consent has to be talked about. So that is something, yes, when we are talking about. And also, as students of, as a postgraduate student, you are aware of, and when we are talking about consent is not a one-time process. Consent is an on-time, ongoing thing. At any point in time, even while you are publishing a research paper, somebody is saying that no, it should not be included, we cannot include it, because our interlocutors, our relationship with our research participants, our interlocutor is something very, very primary and very important, and that cannot be violated at any moment. So we have to be, it is a constant, it has to be a practice in our everyday thing as we speak, as we are talking about. And other ways in which we need to think about actively, it is not that as in whom are you talking, whose lives are you talking about? Is it the research need to be always that going and studying from the bottom, no, looking from the top and looking at the bottom, or can we reimagine research in different ways? How do we think about where are the knowledge producers are? There is this conventional notions, no, anthropology, you go and study the other who are much more vulnerable. From that, there are conversations that comes, and now people, community started asking us, don't treat us as your data, because then there is this very, there is a theoretical Brahmin elsewhere and an empirical Shudra elsewhere that would come in, and that is what Gopal Guru has written at some point. That kind of the hierarchy that create knowledge hierarchy, which has come in. And I don't know whether you touched upon the knowledge hierarchy, but all of this would come as we talk about what would be our research practice, who are our interlocutor, how do we make collaborative research practice possible. And in disability studies particularly, when we are talking about disability as an analytical category, we are also trying to think about, yes, it is challenging the conventional ways in which we understood knowledge. So the pedagogic practices, how do we even think about classroom, and what ways in which knowledge needs to be democratized? That is something, and disability studies that strongly bring in that democratization as we speak. And thank you for opening up that conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Myself, I am Vidya Vasni. So my question is, you spoke on ableism, no, ma'am. How the ableism is only it is related with the person with physical disabilities, or it is related with mental disabilities person also, ma'am?
It is, I'm sorry, I don't know whether I got your name correctly. What is your name?
Vidya Vasni, ma'am.
Vidya. Vidya, so yeah, when we're talking about ableism, we are not only talking about ableism as in terms of that creation of physical disability and wow, we are talking about ableism as an ideology that is overpowering us. That is why I brought in that image of the cattle barrier, which is an ableist, or this thing. Somebody is restricting and saying that only certain people can enter in, not everybody can enter. Or if you think about what kind of classroom, table and chairs you use, can everybody write with that? Can we think about universal design, which is much more inclusive? For example, in classrooms, often students complain that table and chair often is not meant for somebody who is using actively their left hand. No, some of the classrooms you will see. So how do we even think about then making it possible? So ableism then comes in different ways as an ideology, both affecting, discriminating cognitive, physical, all kind of diversity we have in our bodies. For example, as someone who worked on mental health for some time, I know that persons diagnosed with mental illness often has been stereotyped as somebody who is not capable of taking decision. And that would also come in, this is the diagnosis of mental illness, often that is come as something, considering somebody is not capable of doing certain things. So that assumption, that became an overpowering assumption, then that takes away so many things. Your right to adopt a child, your right to have property, then you would see that that has been used as a context to divorce women, because saying that somebody is mentally incapacitated, it will come into the medical legal domain. So we would see that ableism comes in different forms and different shapes in that way. Yeah, so it is not only restricted to physical
Yes.
ability. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Karthika again. Ma'am, it was a great overview for us as a faculty. Also, I'm able to understand it. We have talked about all these ideas, but not exactly like in the terms that you used. And I'm just wondering, like you talked about politics of representation and I mean systemic oppression. So if I have to read, because we do interpret a lot of literature that's based on disability, but it's I don't know, for me and for a few of our colleagues, it's a very new field. So what would be the suggestion? Like, what are the books that I can read so that I can actually know much more about the theoretical aspects of disability studies?
I can share material with you, Kartika. Would that help? I
Yes,
can
yes,
email and you can share with your students. That
yes,
would be. And also another thing I was thinking, as I assume that you're a teacher of literature as well, right?
yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so would be also, in particularly in literature classroom, we can also bring in some of those popular movies. You can think about Tamil movies, for example. Sometimes it comes very starkly as ableist, misogynist, and one can take examples and see how do we, see infantilizing persons, where do they located? Number of examples one can imagine, other than the outside that classic text which we can think of. But
Yes.
of course, I can send you
Yes,
material.
and we are also the process of creating maybe a particular course specifically on disability studies. But Dr. Hemachandran was saying like you should not do that. But I'm getting the idea, maybe as you said, like even in film studies, maybe we should include such kind of movies for analysis. Or is it a right thing to have something specifically on disability studies?
Yeah. So yeah, integrating disability as an analytical category in different streams would be a good idea than creating a separate, program. Because, for example, when we are talking about feminist theories, how do we integrate that is an analytical category? So that would make it much more inclusive. Yeah, in film studies or in other kind of cultural studies, any other courses you have, you can definitely include that. That would be wonderful to think about. Yeah.
You so much, ma'am. And to answer your question, like how's our auditorium? It's a beautiful place. We have 3 screens around us, but unfortunately, as you said, it is not accessible for a person with, I mean, who's using a wheelchair. I
Yeah.
guess we need to work on that as well. And I guess like all the students who are here also would be thinking about what you said about
Yeah.
the systemic, oppression that's against disabled bodies as well. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you, Kartika. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Your session provided valuable insights. Thank you for the enlightened session, ma'am. Now, I extend the invitation to Dr. K. Kalevani, Professor of Postgraduate Department of English, to deliver the vote of thanks. Hello, everyone. The way we understand the way our body communicates with us is only with pain or pleasure or comfort or discomfort. Otherwise, we are not conscious of our bodies. So this is where writing bodies, writing the pains and the experiences in English and other books, writing this and representing this literature intertwines. This gives more spaces to explore and analyze and ponder more about bodies and its experiences. In this context, this conference gives us the space how bodies are treated, discriminated, claimed, reclaimed, reasserted, analyzed, and criticized and politicized and stereotyped, and how there is a challenge to fight against this kind of stereotypes, and there is also a challenge for others, so-called able people with able bodies, to understand these problems and go for a harmonious relationship between this discrimination. And in this context, Mom's talk, in a nutshell, was on the inevitable binaries of these bodies. So a body, an able body and a disabled body, apart from this kind of ability, we have other discriminations based on this color and other way we can discriminate bodies. So this binary and the way we relate to the bodies is highly relative, which is inevitable. But we have the responsibility to understand this kind of binaries which are inevitable, and create a harmonious relationship between these a play of binaries in this space. So to summarize, she gave the frames through which we see bodies. It's highly medical, predominantly medical, and it's critical, and we need to look at bodies in the social context also. And she focused on the significance of feminist disability studies, where the binaries are even more stronger, and one need to face the inevitable challenges and address them. So I thank the speaker, and I also thank the participants. I formally thank the principal, the vice principals, the dean, and the faculties of departments, and also the other participants and students. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. So I'll leave then.
Yes, yes.
All the best. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.